$72 from the general fund. This has been happening in the past.
You're speaking to the,
State street aid.
for the proposed budget.
Well, the proposed budget is balanced. State drug fund is also balanced, with revenues of $73,000 and expenditures of $73,000. DEA drug fund is also balanced. Stormwater fund is balanced. Sanitation fund is balanced, but only because I had to do some severe cuts in equipment requests. But I want to remind the board that the sanitation fund still has a fund balance deficit of $186,923. The water fund is unfortunately projected to be a deficit of $74,412. And I also want to remind the board that that fund also carries with it a fund balance deficit of $2.6 million. For the sanitation fund and water fund, when we get to that appropriate time in our work sessions, I'm going to probably recommend rate increases. The sewer fund is balanced. The debt service fund is balanced. The CIP fund is out of balance, but only due to the current year projects which are reflected in the budget and capital outlay notes is balanced. Now, unfortunately, if you haven't noticed already, for the general fund, this is a problem for us this year. Total revenues projected for 2014 is $10,325,013. That represents a decrease in revenue from the 2013 budget of $1,268,593. Total expenditures projected for 2014 in the general fund is $11,445,751, which is a decrease from the 2013 budget of $147,855. The problem we have with the general fund is that it is currently out of balance by $1,120,738. Put this into perspective for you, our problem here with the general fund primarily is revenues. Had revenues come in as projected at 2013, and if they were just even to 2014, you would have literally had a balanced budget and would be on the plus side of $147,855. This, of course, did not happen. So we are facing a very difficult problem as we go into the general fund. I do want to give you, Mr. Mayor and board members, some advice that I have given to every board that I've worked with, and I will tell you that none of them have taken my advice, and you may not either. But you're dealing with an expenditure budget. You're going to start your review tonight with Arts and Rec, an expenditure budget of $11,445,000. Of that amount, there are certain fixed costs, and that includes, because the board has determined that it's not going to deal with salaries or layoffs. If you take out salaries, benefits, utilities, legal, property and casualty insurance, library, and transfers, you end up with $2,300,000 of that $11,445,000. My advice to you is you can spend the next 5 work sessions working very hard and addressing that $2,300,000, of which you would be very, very fortunate. In my experience, I've never seen a council ever cut that amount by more than 5%. And even then, they ended up putting some of it back in during the operation of the next year. But assuming that you can cut it 10%, which is $230,000, you're still having an out of balance situation of $890,000. Assuming that you could cut it even the most optimistic 15%, or $345,000, you're still going to be out of balance $775,000. My suggestion to you, as I have suggested to many councils before, there are big issues and small issues in every budget. The board, at its decision, at its will, can spend the next 5 weeks dealing with what I consider to be small issues, or you can deal with big issues. And those big issues are not going to go away. And those issues that I'm suggesting that we spend our time on are services, and whether we need certain services, whether we can do without certain services, which would, of course, if you could do without them, will lead to reduction in costs. Whether or not you need to continue current programs or whether those programs can be scaled back. I think you need to look at your physical assets, such as parks, and determine whether or not you need all of them and whether or not you need to continue to maintain those. I think you need to look very hard at potential revenue increases, even though that's a very, very unpopular discussion. And I think while we're looking at all of those, I think you also need to take a hard look at schools as well. Of that amount that I mentioned to you, the $11,445,751, $7,127,584 are salaries and benefits, of which represents 62% of your expenditure budget. Your first review tonight is on arts and recreation. As I have mentioned to you in an email before, arts and recreation, this is excluding support services and U.S. Stadium, is projecting a reduction in expenditures as compared to 2013 budget of $82,553. If you add in support services, which is there primarily for administration, and U.S. Stadium, the Arts and Rec Department, including those two functions, is projecting for 2014 a reduction of $39,376 as compared to 2013 budget. Director Good is here to answer your questions, and I'm also here as well.
Can I ask one general question before we get into Arts and Rec? What was, given that this is, I guess, a lot of our first budgets and yours as our city manager as well, what was your directive to each of the department heads? What were they asked to bring, and what sort of cuts and other things did you do before this got presented to us, or are we going to be asked to make the first cuts with things?
Well, I asked each of my department heads, as I've asked every department head that's ever worked for me in my career, to develop a reasonable and defensible budget. That means that I want them to be prepared, and I hope that they are, I believe most of them are, to defend every line item in their budget. And by defense, I mean they need to have a thorough knowledge of each line item, what is projected to be spent out of that line item, and whether or not the cost for those goods and services are either going up or going down. As you review Director Todd's budget, you will see that some of his have gone up. Most of them have gone down, some by a significant amount and some by a very slight amount. And I asked my department heads to be prepared to defend each and every one of those. As they presented their projections to me and then ultimately their 2014 budget, I have reviewed them all. Director Trustee has reviewed them all. Director Trustee will avow to you that I have made changes. Quite frankly, I have increased some of the expenditures because I thought they were too close. I want them to be able to operate next year without coming back to the board or making transfers within their department. Most of those increases were minimal, usually in the hundreds of dollars, sometimes in a couple of thousand or so. I have looked at some of those and made some decreases as well. But I will tell you, board members, that I have not made many changes to those budgets. Again, I feel that as a manager, I have to give my department heads the flexibility to prepare their budget with the understanding that they have to defend it as reasonable and close as they possibly can. And that's my general approach.
Mr. Christie, just a couple of comments before we start on this. Now, the local taxes